Let's probably just do a quick round of introductions.
I'm a friend of Stasia's, and been living in New York for many decades. And I had the opportunity to study specifically diplomatic history at an Ivy League history department, where I had the chance to study under one of the colleagues of Rashid Khalidi and various Palestinian authors, as well as having lived in Israel many times myself over the course of the last 20 years, specifically in the north, where I was fortunate to have the opportunity to live in a predominantly Arab Israeli area. So I had a
Okay.
chance to interact with the locals for many months there.
And you're Jewish, Joseph, right?
And I am Jewish, yes.
Okay, it's different. I'm born and brought up as a Muslim. With regards to that, we've been always told a lot about Palestine and about Israel. It's just when this conflict started in 2023 that we really did lots of research and stuff about Palestine. Just like basically just started educating myself right now. In terms of ethnicity, you could say I'm South African, but like my forefathers came from India like many decades ago and settled in South Africa. So that's how I'm South African as well.
So I've been in touch with Fatima for a few months now, since the beginning of the war, and you've been saying that Israel practices apartheid, and I would just ask you to explain how you came to this opinion.
Basically, Israel's government has demonstrated an intent to maintain the domination of Jewish Israelis um, over Palestine, across Israel, and in the occupied Palestinian territories. Israeli government charter says that it's a state for Jewish people. So, in that, Israeli Arabs do have rights, but and obviously they are allowed to live freely and as well. But obviously, the Israel states that their country is for Jewish people. Um, that aside, that's for the Israeli Arabs. So basically, I'm 41. So I've experienced apartheid when it was coming towards its end, and where the National Party in South Africa was easing off by themselves because of the sanctions placed on them by the United States. They were already easing off apartheid. So basically, when Nelson Mandela was freed from jail, it wasn't so much that he was freeing South Africa. South Africa was being freed from before that. So, but if I have to speak to my parents and to people who have lived under apartheid, when they look at what's happening even right now over the last few years, they feel like it looks like from the outside looking in, Palestinians are treated way worse than even the apartheid, the citizens of South Africa under apartheid. So yes, that is why I would. And in the segregation of the streets, the no travel rules, like from like if a resident of Gaza wants to travel to West Bank, they cannot travel to West Bank except in extreme humanitarian situations. If somebody from West Bank wants to travel to Gaza, they would need to promise that they would not return to West Bank. So that was South Africa before, in under extreme apartheid, where we had four provinces, and like the province where we lived in, you couldn't travel to a white province unless you got permission and you really needed to go there. So that was like what it looks like to us looking at it right now. So Joseph can elaborate further.
The apartheid regime, right, as you know better than anyone, that it was really a regime based on racial
Very,
segregation, right? It was
very brutal, definitely.
it didn't matter if you were a citizen of South Africa, you were immediately characterized along racial or minority lines,
Yes,
and you did not
definitely.
enjoy universal rights as a citizen of that country. The first distinction I would make, and this is coming directly because I had a similar question. This was some 20 years ago, but I've been to Israel many times since, and I've kept friends and colleagues who happen to be Israeli Arabs from the north in particular. And I had the similar questions, like, as an Israeli Arab and as a Muslim, how do you feel being a citizen of Israel? And it's fascinating because what they would tell me is, look, it's not a publicized or popular opinion, but we're actually grateful that we're here. We don't feel that we're disenfranchised. We don't feel like our rights are any different. The only difference is that they, as a whole, and there are exceptions, don't serve in the IDF. If they want to, there's just a special process where they would have to be evaluated separately, but they actually don't have the obligation, unlike, let's say, a Jewish citizen of Israel, to serve in the army, which is compulsory. What they say, look, it's a challenge, it's a complicated issue for us because obviously we are of the same heritage of the Palestinians that live in the occupied territories. And the only thing that separates us is we chose to stay, they chose to flee in 1948. So that is a distinction. They said, look, of course we feel solidarity and we worry about what happens to, what are essentially our Arab brothers across the border in the so-called occupied territories. But that's the anecdotal from every Israeli Arab that I talk to. And the point of fact is that, even with, Likud type governments like Israel has now, at no point has any rights, the fundamental political, civic, religious rights of not just the Arab minority, but every minority in Israel, as far as I'm aware, that's never changed. And so I think it's important to make the distinction that within Israel proper, if you are a citizen of Israel, your rights are guaranteed by law. There is no segregation of any kind. And the point, as you said, that yes, Israel has a national charter of being a homeland for the Jewish people. That's enshrined in its constitution. But I think it's also important to note that Israel is not unique in that regard. There are many ethno-nation states, whether in Europe, in Asia, certainly. India, for instance, is, it's a home of the Indian people. That's enshrined in its constitution, Bharat. To take Israel and say it's a truly apartheid regime, right? And as I understand, apartheid was driven entirely on racial classifications and segregation. Yes. Then the Arab Israelis, who themselves say we're no different than the Palestinians that live in the occupied, we're the same people. We are the same, both in literally they're our cousins. Yes. So if there was a true apartheid regime, then the Arab Israeli citizens, right, would have none of the same rights that they have today. Now, I'm sure, the issue then becomes, what of the occupied territories? We have to remember that those territories specifically, Israel received after specifically the 6-Day War, and then it was further kind of solidified as a territory with no exact legal distinction after Israel also won the Yom Kippur War. And so the problem was what to do with a territory that effectively was won in a war of aggression against it. And sadly, there have been many governments in Israel, particularly in the most recent time, where they have not been the best stewards of that territory. Or you can look in the 90s under Rabin, who was assassinated for this position, but he tried to make full peace, create the occupied territories, right, and give them full autonomy, full statehood. And there was a real process, internationally recognized, and Israel made great strides. So the problem is that what do you do with a territory that prior to its basically capture and war had no international recognition, either as a separate state or, South Africa had a statehood even during apartheid.
So I would say in South Africa, there were no wars as such. Mm-hmm. The other African states didn't come to the aid of Africa and fight wars. The Africans who were displaced from major cities and towns and displaced to African areas. Basically, there were no territories. Mm-hmm. Basically, so that's the really confusing part. It comes to, I think, when somebody's looking in, especially from the outside, you have the Israel as a whole, and then you have Gaza pushed on one side, and then the West Bank on the other side. So basically, you have two countries in one place, but one country is separated from the other half of the country.
What's interesting is that in the 90s, for instance, those Arabs that lived in the what were legally called the occupied territories, they actually had full work authorization and travel at that time. Part of what the Camp David Accords did is that they normalized the free transit of goods and people between Israel and the occupied territories. Those were the best times because they had free flow of goods, free flow of work. In fact, there were Israelis that would even go to Gaza for the nightlife during that period. I mean, there
Right.
was,
Yes, yes, yes.
I think there
It
was
was
a lot
open
of,
completely.
yeah, and there was a real interaction among both populaces. Unfortunately, what happened is that during that time there was an exponential increase in terrorist attacks within Israel proper. In just that 5-year period, there were more deaths straight from suicide attacks or various terrorist bombings within Israel itself than there were in that 5-year period than this entire conflict on the Israeli side. So for them, they felt that unfortunately led to a very reactionary right-wing government in Israel. Said, nope, we're going to tighten security measures. We're going to do this, that, and the other. And that's what's led to these kind of increasingly.
Complete segregation, yes.
Yeah, I think we can both agree that the residents of the occupied territories do not enjoy freedom of travel or any of the civic freedoms that their Israeli Arab brethren do as citizens of Israel, 100%. And it's unfortunate that they are living under those restrictions. But I think it's important maybe to understand that that happened really in the last 20 years, rightly or wrongly, as a response to what happened was that, the sort of the increase of terror acts within Israel itself. So I don't know if I would characterize it as apartheid. It's an unfortunate reality of what happened.
Basically a reaction, yes, yes. What I would say is that, like giving the example of 1994 post-apartheid South Africa, where where we had our free and fair elections and stuff, and obviously there was no revolution. It was very peaceful. The transition was very, very peaceful because of people like Nelson Mandela, and obviously the leaders of all the political parties decided on complete non-violence. There would be no killing of any white people or anything of that sort. So if you look at the crime in South Africa, like even now, it's seriously really, really bad. But that would not mean that now we would return to the state that we were in. Privately, lots of people want to do that, like make gated communities where people feel safer. And obviously they get security companies and they build up these little gated communities where they have security guards checking each person coming in and out and whatever. But obviously the law of the country would not allow that, because obviously you would then be segregating a people according to their race, and that would not be something that would be conducive to a safe and healthy society afterwards. I don't know if maybe at some time down the line, if Israel would come to that sort of solution, or if it would just carry on getting worse and worse.
So it's a complicated, there's a reason why
Definitely. Very,
there are
very.
complicated issues in foreign policy is that there is no easy solution. And that's part of the problem, is that I think, people see the images and they see, just the immediate emotional impact of the deaths and the sad, the tragedy of what this conflict does on a day-to-day basis to the people that live there. But it's unfortunate also in that it glosses over just how historically complex, these aren't just, you can't reduce this, at least in my opinion, to just simple black and white issues. And I think even
Yes, definitely.
apartheid, right? That's a very loaded term in that, again, if at the moment that Israel started to disenfranchise its Arab Israeli citizens, then I would agree, then it's certainly becoming an apartheid regime.
Okay.
Yes. And so the fundamental question is the same one for Israel as it was 20 years ago, is what do you do with the occupied territories? Again, and there have been many government mistakes within Israel. I'm sure Israelis would tell you that first before even I have to. But the question for them remains, look, in their mind, we tried peace. We made a good effort. We were rewarded with more terror. Some wanted to continue. It doesn't matter. We need to push ahead. Others said, no, we need to take care of our citizens' safety first. Unfortunately, what that can look like is very heavy-handed responses and very heavy-handed treatment of the occupied territories.
Yes.
But that's where the problem stems, is that how do you address that issue? And then maybe we're going too much off topic, but then the question becomes, who are you really negotiating that peace with? Is it with the PLO? Are the PLO the best representative of the Palestinian people in occupied territories, or is it Hamas? And then the problem with Hamas is that Hamas doesn't recognize the state of Israel or anyone from it. So how do you negotiate with an entity that doesn't recognize you or your right to exist? And I'm speaking again from the Israeli perspective. So that's where I think a lot of these challenges are. And I think
what do you think the solution is here? How I mean, I have no idea, but like, do you think for Israel to eliminate Hamas is the number one goal right now, and it will lead them to some kind of opportunity for negotiation, or at the cost of all these civilian lives that will be lost in Palestine? Like,
in fact, I'm curious your perspective on that question.
what would you think, for example, Israel should have done after October 7th?
Okay, so I would say first we need to look at Netanyahu and Netanyahu's government. So I think from the time it worked out, like for the right-wing government, obviously, again, with all due respect, not for the Israeli people, at one stage, by segregating all of the Palestinians into Gaza and having Hamas as their ruler, and then having the other people in West Bank, and then having the Palestinian Authority on that side. So basically, the people to negotiate with would be the Palestinian Authority. And obviously, Hamas is a militant group. If you look at it, I would just giving an example. If there were two parties in South Africa who were fighting for freedom, it would have been the ANC and the IFP. The ANC agreeing to more negotiations, and then the IFP maybe looking to fight fire with fire, or to fight it out. So at that time, it was the government and Netanyahu's government who found it better to have Hamas to deal with the Palestinian problem, to say, okay, they ruled by Hamas, so we cannot negotiate with them and leave it at that, and just keep them there, and we just not worried about them, and if they're going to attack us, we're going to attack them back. And then, like, also dealing with the Palestinian Authority on the West Bank side, eventually also Hamas spreads to the West Bank somehow, or the Hamas's ideology spreads to the West Bank, and then if they met with that on the West Bank side, instead of dealing with the Palestinian Authority, then just resorting to extreme violence in retaliation to what Hamas does. As a response to 7th October, you see, when there was the Al Qaeda attacks and the Twin Towers and stuff, and when the United States invaded Afghanistan, and where they invaded Iraq, and where they just carpet bombed, and it basically created a bigger problem because they left Afghanistan in a mess, and obviously now the Taliban are back, and they've created a whole new brand of ISIS and terrorism and everything that goes with. However, somewhere in the 2000s, it was where they sent in like a very special forces, targeted. Nobody even knew about it until they got what they wanted, and where they got to Osama bin Laden's base, and where they got hold of him and arrested him and killed him or whatever. But in that sense, if they want Hamas, the Israeli army and the United States and the British are all equipped enough to do it surgically, and to do it in such a way where they, obviously Hamas is not only based in Gaza. Hamas ideologies are in West Bank, everywhere, but the way the carpet bombing the people, blocking off the entrances and exits, cutting off food, cutting off water, just bombing the entire place, is creating more Hamas, and not only in Palestine, It's basically going to create a situation where you're going to have fighters from the other parts of the Arab countries or even Muslim countries who will be prepared to take up, because they did say, you killed a child's mother, you killed their parents, you created a Hamas soldier. Because Hamas is an ideology. Basically, they feel they are fighting for their freedom. So, and for all the prisoners that got released, like for all the hostage exchanges and stuff like that, all those prisoners who did get released are not going to thank the Palestinian Authority, because the Palestinian Authority didn't get them released, but it was Hamas who got them released. So you basically created um, more people to follow Hamas's ideology afterwards.
It's a challenging question, obviously, because I think you have to look at it from, first of all, from the responsibility of a government, and putting aside, Netanyahu and his party, which again is not, if you look, is not very popular among Israeli voters themselves. But putting even that aside, I think it's a problem for any government, is what do you do when there is, any way you want to define it, it was mitigated terrorist attack. Civilians were completely targeted, not just kidnapped, but killed in very brutal ways. That happened. And so a government, especially, Israel is not a very large country. And so that has a big psychological impact, the same way I would argue, psychologically speaking, right, 9/11 had for many Americans. So a government of any kind, left, right, it doesn't matter, they have an obligation to, quote unquote, do something, right? And so that always creates a dynamic where a government is forced to respond, right? To show that, look, we care about the deaths of our citizens, and we need to work on something to protect. I've spoken to reservists that fought in Lebanon and that also served in Gaza, both during the Camp David Accords and afterwards. If you recall, there was an operation there about when Israel left and gave full autonomy initially. Hamas took over and then started to launch rockets. That was actually one of their first things that they did, was they launched rocket attacks. They had full autonomy. This was before Israel implemented border restrictions. And it's also important to note that there are actually two borders on Gaza. There's the Rafah crossing that's fully administered by Egypt. And interestingly enough, Egypt has been more strict on the border and the flow of goods, both before and certainly after the conflict emerged. So it isn't just Israel responsible for sort of cutting off the border and the transit through it. And Egypt has its own position. They view Hamas as a dangerous military organization. I've had the chance to talk to someone from the PLO. Obviously, they're political rivals, so they don't have the best opinion of Hamas. But Hamas isn't the sole representative of the Palestinian people. There are many Palestinians that don't agree with the actions of Hamas. But I agree with you, as unfortunately, when you see the images of dead civilians in Gaza, when you see the results of the bombings, that's going to inspire more solidarity to Hamas. And to your point, the problem is that I think you can look at Hamas as a liberation organization, but if you delve into Hamas as a political organization, you take them at their word, right? At their charter, their stated intent, what they've said in both the Arabic press and in English. They firmly believe, and this is part of their charter and their fundamental belief, that no Jew living in Israel has the right to live there, period, right? So they are an organization, at least, committed to not just liberation of territories, but the full elimination of Jewish people in the state of Israel. And so the problem is, if you're the Israeli government, how do you deal with an organization that's fully committed ideologically, politically, socially to your complete elimination? So that's where I think a lot of the heavy-handed, unfortunately, and I agree, Israel's made some terrible decisions tactically and strategically in how they choose to deal with the security threat. But the challenge is, how do you as a government deal with an organization that's constantly, every chance they get, commits terror attacks against your civilians, not just your army? Part of what enabled U.S. Special Forces in Afghanistan, for instance, to, let's say, eliminate a bin Laden or certain cells of his organization was that they were in remote mountainous areas or places that they weren't deeply embedded in the middle of a city or a densely populated civilian area.
I think when they did get Osama bin Laden, I think he was not in Afghanistan, he was in Pakistan.
Yes,
So
correct. But
yes, they could have. I mean, like US could have hit. I mean, like started bombing Pakistan indiscriminately. However, they did send in special forces and just get directly to him.
I have relatives that served in the IDF and those that were in that zone of operation. They say the challenge is how do you send in a special forces when, for instance, literally Hamas has units embedded in a school or a hospital that's surrounded by civilians. So how do you send in a special forces team when they don't, no one of those soldiers, if you talk to those units, they don't want to go in there and accidentally shoot a child or shoot a civilian. No one wants to do that. That's the challenge, is that to identify these targets of interest, it's not so easy as just to say send in a team. What does that team do, right? When they have to sift civilians, they have to potentially expose themselves to fire or have to fire back with civilians in the midst, and so that's what complicates the problem.
Can I
Is
ask something?
Sure.
What about those three Hamas leaders who are worth 11 billion together and they're just flying around the world, live in Qatar? Like, why aren't they brought to responsibility? Like, why are they so public, going around representing terrorist organization, and no one actually does anything to them?
Can't speak to them or their alleged billions. I think there is.
I also don't understand that part, yes, because I would always say like if you have those billions, why don't you use it to better the people? So I also don't know what's happening with those.
Well, I think part of the problem is that Hamas within Gaza has a very strict control of the area. So I think in the West Bank, for instance, there is a lot of public debate and criticism of Hamas. You can find it pretty easily, I think, in Ramallah and other areas where the PLO is strongest. And my understanding is that Qatar, if we talk about Qatar, Qatar actually has I wouldn't say direct sponsor, but they have financially assisted for many decades Hamas and some of the affiliate organizations. So for them, I think they give Khaled Mashal and others free reign to live there because they have been a financial supporter of that organization. So that's part of the reason, is that if your host country's been supporting your organization, why would they interfere with the individuals?
But I think that's untouchable in this.
But that's a question for Palestinians themselves. And I think Palestinians, again, if many West Bank Palestinians don't like Hamas, they don't want Hamas power. So I'm sure they would love to do something about it. But what can they do sitting in the West Bank when Qatar as a government supports, those individuals?
Just a question that I've been like from what I've heard, Israel's intelligence, Mossad, is like one of the best intelligence in the world, like probably rivaling the CIA and stuff like that. So with that, I would ask what happened with their intelligence for the 7th of October. Okay, I'll pose my next question after that.
I agree. I think most Israelis, if you speak to them, I have relatives and friends who are all as deeply shocked and puzzled. No one understands, and they can't understand whether this was just incompetence, whether it was something where they just didn't take the matter seriously enough. Unfortunately, it's one of those things, just like there were questions about what happened to American intelligence that allowed something like 9/11 to happen. I think we'll never know, unfortunately, right? As there's a lot of shock and outrage across all Israelis of how this could have happened. So no one quite knows. I've had former statesmen speak, and they oftentimes say a lot of the world is ready to believe in conspiracy theories when most of the time it can be explained through just simple human error and incompetence. Who knows what the ultimate answer is, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a matter of simply they didn't care, they didn't take the warning seriously, or someone was asleep at the wheel.
I wanted to bring the topic that I see a lot. A lot of people say that Israel, even before they started carpet bombing Gaza, was committing genocide. I want to hear both of your opinions if you think Israel did commit genocide.
In this situation, the use of the word genocide is not correct in terms of the population of the Palestinians were rising, and the Israeli Arabs and stuff. So genocide is the wrong word to use. However, I would say that we could say oppression. In 2023, 38 children were killed in West Bank. Okay, if we start like let's say even 1948, there's like documented things of how they were living peacefully. I mean, there were people who joined in the war, but there were towns and villages of farmers who were living quite peacefully and who were prepared to make peace with the Jewish people. They in fact invited them over like for meals and stuff like that because they were prepared to live in peace. And then like within few days they were then just forced out of their lands into refugee camps, their lands taken away, their villages and farms taken away, and then to such an extent where some of them were left empty for decades and nobody did anything to it. The olive farms just left to rot. Like there were lots of ups and downs in between that time till now on both sides. I do accept that. And then but if you look at the time, right, from the time Gaza was created with Hamas, and then the entire segregation of Gaza, we're just giving them water and electricity at will, cutting it off whenever they wanted to. The the use of herbicide on the borders of Gaza, where there are farmlands with which the people of Gaza use, and those farmlands are then completely eradicated because of the use of herbicide. Also, in West Bank, farmers are not allowed to. Citizens and farmers are not allowed to collect rainwater. They only are allowed to buy water from Israel. If Israeli forces enter a land where there are Palestinians, Palestinians are used as human shields for the Israeli forces. So also the Palestinian areas that are designated in the Israeli states are constantly taken away. They're broken into, as we've spoken before, I think from the voice notes that you've sent, Joseph, and where you did acknowledge where that settlers are taking their land away. If this was not allowed and this was not the right thing to do, the IDF supposed to have been stopping this, but at most times the IDF allow this and they help the settlers to take from the Palestinian people to such an extent that right now USA is actually canceling visas for individuals who are taking land from settlers who are taking land from Palestinians. So and this has been happening for quite a long time. There's as I say, there's a long list of all the atrocities that have been committed. I'm talking about checkpoint rapes, checkpoint stripping, shooting of children. Basically, Israel comes across as a very trigger happy country where they would just shoot at children indiscriminately, shoot at people, shoot at sometimes their own civilians by mistake. So in that way, I would not use the word genocide, but I would say systematic oppression.
There's a lot to unpack there. So I'll try to, as best as I can, because I think you raised some great points, and I think let me try to go kind of on point by point of what you brought up. Is it's a really worthwhile discussion. I think so many of the issues that we're debating stem from these core matters. So I would say you brought up 1948, and I think part of Sadly, a lot of that history gets forgotten as really a one of the, not the only, but one of the starting points of a lot of this conflict and division. And you know, the problem is that you have a mosaic of different individual villages, individual accounts, individual stories. I had the opportunity to read primary source documents, testimonies recorded both in print and online, of survivors, of people who witnessed what happened. This is, for instance, the genesis of the Israeli Arab populace, not all of them, but the majority, is that they were villages that actually did not either fight on either side during the conflict when it erupted, and did not oppose when Israelis took up defensive positions that ultimately became incorporated in what is the post-1948 Israel. And they would argue, well, we chose not to fight and do anything, and therefore we've become Israeli citizens as a result, and we're happy with the rights that we have as Israeli citizens. To your point, there were incidents of villages, and again, it's hard to say, you can't make blanket statements, because at that time you had the army, you had various militant groups on both sides. At that time, there wasn't a Palestinian organization. There were Arab armies in coordination with Palestinian locals, and you had various, militant groups that were there. You also had things like the Irgun that operated outside the confines of the state of Israel as it existed at that time. So you had unsanctioned acts by people like the Irgun that were not supported or condoned by the Israeli army or the government in 1948, and that unfortunately led to deaths in villages or driven out that, again, were not the policy of the government, that wasn't intended, as there were massacres of Jewish settlements that happened to be on the other side of the border when the conflict erupted. So it did happen on both sides. It's hard to say, it's hard to take isolated incidents and say that amounted to a whole policy by the people or the government. Jumping forward, right, is that 1948 was a defensive war, at least from the Israeli perspective, because they were attacked by Arab armies, and they took measures that they felt to defend the core territories of what was assigned to the Jewish people.
Can I quickly ask, while we're still in 1948, a lot of people are saying that refugees have the right to return to Israel, the ones that fled in 1948. Joseph, can you just tell me your opinion about this?
Again, it's also very complicated, because not every refugee, some deliberately were driven out, either as a defensive measure or by unsanctioned acts by what I would call splinter or militant groups like the Irgun. But there were others that were deliberately evacuated because either they were told by Arab armies at the time that they need to evacuate to take up a defensive position, and then that territory was taken because the war was lost on the Arab side. So what do you do in that situation? You had a people that followed orders, followed the instructions by the Arab armies or their local government at the time. That land was now been taken, what was originally as a defensive measure, and now is incorporated in Israel proper. So what do you do? And I think everyone would agree that there has to be some restitution. Whether that restitution amounts to the specific return of that land, I think is probably more of a case-by-case basis than just this is a solution for everyone. I think it's complicated by the fact that every family has its own specific circumstance of what happened to them and how it happened and why. I can only say what the Camp David Accords tried to do, is that was central to what those peace accords were, is that there had to be a restitution. And I think the last formulation of this that I think the PLO and the Israeli government were working towards was some sort of a financial restitution rather than an exchange of land. Because I think both parties recognize an exchange of land then becomes incredibly complicated, because again, every family has a different circumstance and a different story to tell. So how do you find a universal government solution for that? But Fatima, I'm sorry, going to points, fast forwarding to kind of the present, you had territories that in the Arab world weren't even acknowledged as either independent or as part of their own territories, and then were taken originally as a defensive measure. Israel happened to win these wars. They took this territory. What do we do with it? For the first many decades, they had no answer to that question. And originally in the Camp David Accords, the settler movement, even across Israeli society, was seen as very fringe. No one really liked them. They did not have popular support. They were seen as independent actors that ultimately had to be removed for a peace process to happen. And unfortunately, rightly or wrong, right? And I can only see what I saw happen, and speaking to both Israeli Arab citizens and Jewish Israeli citizens, is that the reaction to the terror attacks that happened in the late 90s, early 2000s, unfortunately led to a direct empowerment of Likud and other right-wing forces that do support the settler movement. And I think it's important to acknowledge that the settler movement is not something that enjoys widespread popularity within Israel. It is something that is only really supported by a very small minority, both of Israelis and even of government parties. Unfortunately, those government parties started to get power as kind of a knee-jerk response to, we're seeing deaths, we're trying to make peace, but we're getting blown up on the streets and in cafes. And so that empowered these parties that said, okay, well, the answer to this is we're going to just expand the settler movement. And I think we could agree, as most Israelis will tell you, that's not the solution. And that's unfortunately what's leading to, a lot of what you read about this unfair treatment. And it is, there are very unfair treatments of Palestinians, families, children, farmers. That's at the hands of the settlers. And the IDF, unfortunately, is called in to protect them, even though if you talk to many of those soldiers, they don't want to be there and they don't like the settlers themselves, but they're ordered to protect because they're still technically citizens of Israel, even though most Israelis don't support them. So it is a challenging issue. I think, unfortunately, you have to take into account what the settlers do isn't necessarily reflective of the Israeli people as a whole, or even most government parties within Israel.
Can I jump in there just to relate something that I've watched on a documentary?
Yes.
And this was really heartwarming to watch as a mother in one of the West Bank territories where, where settlers live together with Palestinian families. And this was something really interesting where the settlers would harass children going to school. And basically, the IDF would have to come in to make sure that the children are not harassed on their way to school. And the days when the IDF soldiers are not around to see that the Palestinian children are getting to school safely and coming back home, you'd get ordinary Israeli citizens who would just stand there with a camera, with a pretend camera, pretending to video the settlers. And that would basically stop them from harming the children. So seeing that, you could definitely see that it just needs understanding on both sides for the conflict to be resolved.
That's unfortunately sorely lacking, whether it's in that region or sadly most parts of the world. I think there's two things that happen, is that people forget the historic complexity of a lot of modern day problems. And then they also forget to put themselves in the shoes of the different parties and try to live
Definitely.
a day in their life before they come and comment.
Yes.
Mhm.
So I was saying that to be from all sides, all the different parties, the Palestinian Authority, I think the Lebanese would have to play their part. The Gazans would have to play their part. Hamas would need to change their ideology completely if they want a seat at the table. And they would need to, really discuss being one state and having political parties.
Unless Hamas effectively stops being Hamas as they're defined today, I think we can all agree there's no functional peace process of any kind with an organization like that. And that's a position that even the PLO and many Palestinians, for instance, in the West Bank, would say as well, is that they wouldn't want Hamas to be representing them as a national liberation organization. So
the only solution is to eliminate Hamas at the end of the day, to
I
be
the
able to have
question
any
is
peace talk.
what the solution,
How
well,
do you eliminate?
yeah, that's another question. I think, unfortunately, that would have to be a whole different debate. I think that with time, however the Palestinians, for instance, themselves resolve it, part of the breakdown of the peace accords, we can go back to 20 years, is that unfortunately you didn't have the most responsible statesman on the Palestinian side. And then you had, as a reaction to that, Netanyahu, interestingly enough, and many of his Likudniks that also weren't very much, let's say, engaged in the process of peacemaking. So I think you need that confluence of people, politicians that actually represent the will of the people who do want that peace. And once you have that again, because you did, it's not like that has never happened before. We had a period of time where there were, both governments and both peoples really actively talking to each other and working towards a solution. So if it happened then, there's no reason not to believe it can't happen again.
Hamas is in power without being elected there. So that's something to look at as well. They are basically a militant organization in ruling over 2.2 million people. And the people to, I think, negotiate with would be Mahmoud Abbas's party on the West Bank side, like the Palestinian Authority. However, there is Hamas infiltration in the West Bank as well, who are not happy with the way Mahmoud Abbas is doing things. I really think that maybe sometime United States, Britain, the United Nations would really need to step up and create a peacekeeping organization.
And what do you think? I saw a recent poll in Gaza, and it says that 75% of people supported October 7th attack. And how do you, I don't know, re-educate people to make them also willing to have peace with Israel and not feeling that the whole land of Palestine, Israel belongs to them? Like, how do you change people's mindsets?
And I think it's hard to question the veracity of a poll in the Gaza territories when, that's completely controlled by Hamas. So it's always difficult to trust data that comes from there. But I think the quick answer to that is that you've now had almost bordering 15 years of kind of complete Hamas control of the Gaza Strip. And so one of the first things that Hamas did is that they changed the educational curriculum and very strictly controlled a lot of the elementary school policies that are in Gaza. And so, unfortunately, they're trying to educate an entire generation in very sort of a very one-sided Hamas ideology that doesn't even align with the school books and the curriculum of what's being taught in the West Bank, for instance, under PLO administration. So we have to start from that, is that, you have Hamas deliberately trying to re-educate and propagandize an entire generation of Palestinians under their rule. So I think the simple answer that I would say is you would have to change that aspect. You would need, to Fatima's point, a democratically elected, whether that's the PLO or some other representatives, not a militant organization that rules by force and dictates what it teaches its children by force. You would need that to change.
But then the radicals will continue to do suicide bombings and other kind of attacks. And do you just wait till that generation of radicals, goes to prison or like?
I think also it would make a big difference if saying that, and with Hamas and everybody needs to be re-educated and stuff as well. However, also from the side of Israel and the IDF, they need to be able to not see every Palestinian as Hamas. Just one story where this lady says, I don't know if you'll have an idea of how a couple gets married, and they say they really save up to put a deposit down for a house, and they just finish repaying off their home and ready to start a family, and then she says, my entire home is bombed. So in that way, I think Palestinians want to be seen as people, as not just Hamas, not just militants. And I think that's what stems also from 1948, and where they feel like they were not seen as a people.
I absolutely agree with you, Fatima. I think the more that both governments and both peoples remember that these are individuals that collectively.
Individuals, definitely. Yes, they are definitely people who really are looking for peace, who see Palestinians as individuals. And those are the people that would bring about peace, because those are the people who brought about peace in South Africa. Peace was not just brought about by Black Africans. It was brought about by whites helping them. Lots of white people joined the ANC. And basically that's what made a big difference, where people need to see that people on the other side are willing to negotiate. So I think that makes a very big difference as well.
To be honest, I feel like the West doesn't help in resolving this conflict. I see a lot, like they demonize one of the sides and pretty much uh, describing people as the government policies instead of trying to find people who want to have peace and emphasize their desire for peace. And
I think if anything has emerged that we could both agree, Fatima, is that unfortunately we don't have statesmen of the caliber that you had in South Africa when apartheid
Yes,
ended.
definitely.
Whether it was
Yes,
in the West,
definitely.
Israel, or Palestinian territories, we would have a very different outcome today. And that's the sad
Definitely,
part. We don't
definitely.
have statesmen of that caliber.
Um, like just looking at Nelson Mandela, and Nelson Mandela did subscribe to at first lots of violence, and but to free South Africa, he chose to leave the violence and stay in jail for 27 years just to raise awareness. And he could have resisted arrest. They could have just carried on like what it was, but the statement that he made was staying in jail for 27 years for the peace to come about. However, as I do say, I mean, lots of people would say, and I'm not in any way saying that violence is ever an answer. However, people who were left behind when Nelson Mandela was not in jail, the other, like you can say, the Umkhonto overseas, where the military side of the ANC, they they did carry out attacks. They did do lots of stuff to to get attention from countries around the world. So yeah, so that's also that happens as well. I'm not
mhm.
saying it's the right thing, but um, oppressed people do take up arms.
There's so much of the historic background to this that we're kind of glossing over. Uh,
Yes,
and
yes.
that deserves a whole other in-depth conversation. There's so much from 1948 or even before it, and certainly in the decades after, there's so much that has led to the present problems. And what's unfortunate, and you'll hear many Palestinians say the same, is that, why has the Arab world as a whole largely not abandoned, not supported them in the way that they would have liked, have not had the same solidarity, have not welcomed Palestinians. They continue to treat Palestinians as refugees in their own kind of brother countries. And so there's a regional kind of indifference to Palestinians, even among the Arab world, that I think would have to change for there to be a meaningful solution as well. And that has been part of the problem, is that it's kind of left to Israel and the Palestinians when that indifference contributes to that impressive reality. And that's not just the Israeli side, that's not just Palestinian, whether it's Hamas or PLO rule, but there's a wider regional indifference and a regional kind of history to why Arab states have, for instance, have played a big role in what happened to the Palestinians. And
I myself do not agree with lots of the Arab policies. And when I did do research about how the British won, like basically the place of Palestine, and how complicit the Arabs were and stuff like that. So I would really realize that the Arabs had different ulterior motives. I'm talking about the Arabs from the bordering countries. Once they got their border properties, they were they were not really bothered with what happened in Palestine. Besides the two wars that they played a hand in, it didn't bother them what happened afterwards to Palestine. It was like they've got their parts and they're not stressed after that.
sadly, a lot of those same Arab states, as you said, I think even more cynically, I think that they exploited Palestinians for their own ulterior motives, rather than really championing their cause or finding a reasonable solution.
Now that Stasia brought up the Arabs, if the Arabs, Egyptians, United States, Britain, all of them really need to come in, and it would be even the Qataris who are hosting Hamas who need to step up and step in, and basically say that we really need to discuss a solution.
Oh, it feels like a long way to go. so many
It always
actors have
seems
to.
really
Mhm.
bleak. Yes, it always seems really bleak. Like if we look at the situation in South Africa, it's not 100% even now. Even before apartheid was abolished eventually, in the late 80s, it seemed really terrible. Where everybody said that nothing would come out of it. Nelson Mandela is rotting in jail, and nothing was going to happen. And then something did happen. So I think, as I say, let's not just let's leave it. Let's hope for Israeli people, Palestinian people. I'm talking about from grassroots level coming up and you know um, choosing better governments, choosing better people to lead them to bring about change.
Yeah. Thank you, guys. It was really interesting to listen to both of you, and I hope it will be helpful to some of our viewers. And yeah, we can have another conversation if you'd like in the future.
Sure.
But yeah,
Okay.
it's
Thank you, Joseph, for
That
making
was
the time.
a pleasure to speak with you. And
It's very lovely meeting the both of you. Thank you so much.
likewise. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.